So hello and welcome to you all here. I got a chance to speak with some of you. My name is Stacy Lewis, and I'm the Publicity and Marketing Director here at City Lights. Am I speaking into the mic? Yep, okay. I'm also a graduate of UC Santa Cruz with a degree in American Studies, Porter College, 1993. And a grateful student of Dana Frank, who served as my thesis advisor. I want to thank the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association for their co-sponsorship of tonight's evening. John Pine, who I think may have left already, Assistant Vice Chancellor of Alumni Engagement, helped to put this event together. I also want to thank James Tracy and the Labor and Community Studies program at City College in San Francisco for their co-sponsorship as well. I think that this is our 5th time hosting Dana. Each time Dana publishes a new book, I get in touch and I make sure that we properly celebrate the occasion at City Lights. Most recently, that was in 2018 for her last book, The Long Honduran Night, Resistance, Terror, and the United States in the Aftermath of the Coup. As I told many of you here, City Lights is the proud publisher of Dana's Local Girl Makes History, which I like to describe as the show podcast This American Life, but NorCal style. And there's a terrific essay on the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk's cave train ride, as well as the Redwood Slice Monument at Big Basin that sadly did not survive the fires of 2021. And I think that Dana has heard this story more than once, but my path to working in publishing and at City Lights is because of her. As my senior thesis advisor, Dana guided me on the completion of my essay on the role of the Communist Party in helping to organize 2 unions in the 1930s. She patiently listened to my woes about not knowing what to do with my life upon graduation. She assured me that UC Santa Cruz graduates go on to do meaningful work. And then she talked about the amazing experience she had just had when she published her first book with Beacon Press, and how perhaps I should consider a job in publishing. And this made complete sense to me, having spent the last 4 years reading and critically thinking about books and texts. And now, 30 years later, here we are together to celebrate the publication of Dana's latest. What can we learn from the Great Depression, stories of ordinary people, and collective action in hard times? We find ourselves in an extraordinary and surreal time. As I mentioned to Dana earlier, each New York Times breaking news announcement of Trump's cabinet and administration feels like an Onion magazine parody. How can this be real? Once our grieving is done, we all need to figure out ways to participate and move forward, and Dana's book could not be published at a more opportune time. Dana Frank is Professor Emerita of History at the University of Santa Cruz, a well-regarded senior historian. She is the author of many books on labor, women, and social justice in the US and Honduras. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Nation, Foreign Affairs, and many other publications, and she's testified before both the US Congress and Canadian Parliament. Historian Robin D.G. Kelly says, in this urgent and illuminating book, Dana Frank shares stories revealing the collective power of marginalized workers, the real threat of fascism and the racism that fuels it, and the capacity of ordinary people to find and care for each other despite these deep structural divisions. She is that rare scholar able to mobilize the lessons of history against our present catastrophe. Please welcome Dana Frank.
Santa Cruz tonight. Some of you who just came in don't know that it's I'm loud. It was a little alumni reception before, and so there are 2 of you that are not UCSC alumni, and those of you who didn't know it, I graduated from UCSC myself in 1978, and the answer to your math question is 68. Thank you to everyone who's here. Thank you, James Tracy, for inviting me to speak about one of the chapters at the, oh wait, where did the book go? Here it is. When you write a book, there's the sacred first copy. There's the sacred first copy, which is the first one you get, and then you don't get some more for a couple of weeks. And this is the one you carry around to book signings and markup and keep track of the errors in the back, and you never want to lose it. So it's very, like, this is the one you use, and it's marked up. So thank you to Jane, to the UCSC alumni staff. Thank you, Peter, from the events coordinator for City Lights and City Lights. And of course, Stacy, what an amazing person she is year after year. I always say I'm never going to write another book, and I really mean it this time, but it's really always a thrill to be here and watching her career and seeing her be part of this City Lights thing and watching her family grow up now. And of course, the preciousness of City Lights, that we all know how precious it is, and still thriving, still a collective space, still right here in the middle of town. And thank you for everyone who came, and including my former students. When former friend of mine is a sophomore from my sophomore year at UCSC, and a bunch of my former students here. So that, other than Stacy, that's really thrilling. Okay, let me talk about the book and I have to figure out how to pile things up here. Some of you may know me only from Honduras solidarity work and writing about that, and others have known me since long before I did anything in Honduras, and when I was teaching and writing about US history. And I always, in all these years, had what I called my day job, teaching and writing about US labor and working class history and related themes. And I have been working, for complicated reasons, I've been working on Honduras and writing about it for about 20 years now. And I got tired of fighting the State Department in real time. It was still too intense. And because of Trump, I decided to return to researching and writing about US history as my way of fighting racism and incipient fascism. And I kept, when I started thinking about this, I would write about some op-eds about various things. And I kept having ideas about the 30s, which I had, in my later years teaching, I taught a whole class about it after the 2008 recession. I taught that class for my last few years. And I always taught about the 30s a lot in my labor history class. And the genesis of this book was that I was interested, I knew about the Black Legion, which I'll talk to you about in a bit. I knew about fascism in the 30s, and I was interested in what stopped it, and particularly whether it was the New Deal that stopped it. And I pitched a couple articles to some editors whose names I had at Harper's and New Yorker, and they wanted it to be about a single figure. And I thought, I don't write that kind of history, although I did actually just write about a single figure that I can talk about if you want. A congressman from Ohio in Jim Jordan's district who was a part of this organized fascist group. And so I decided I wanted to write what I wanted to write. And so I decided to write a book, and I was originally going to have 7 chapters, and I wrote the first one, about the wet nurses strike, which I'll tell you about in a bit. And it was 85 pages long in manuscript, which is about 60 in typeset. And I thought, this is the genre I want to write in. And my Local Girl Makes History book is in this genre. The book about women banana workers is original. It's a very interesting genre to write in, because you have to hold a narrative for a long time. And you can do things that you can't do in 40 pages, which would be more usual, or 50. And you can go deep in things, and you go sideways and backwards and forwards and bring it up to the present and take it place, but you have to hang on to the reader the whole time. And so it's quite a challenge on your brain when you're writing, because when you're a historian, you cannot move any faster than you can marshal the evidence and keep track of it. And so it's different than writing fiction, where you can just get up, and I'm exaggerating how easy to write fiction, but you always have to stay close to the evidence and, line up all your ducks all the time. So you have to carry that story as a writer, just the writing part. We're not talking about the research and the outlining part. So it ended up being 4 long chapters. They're about 50 pages each typeset. The chapters are autonomous, so you can read them in any order and not read the ones you're bored by. Okay, it's a party on the balcony. Okay, well, we could listen in on the conversation. Might be more interesting. And each chapter brings up the story up to the present in reflective ways that historians don't normally do. And I decided I don't care about the rules. I want to talk about how this comes up to the present in different ways. I have to say, when I was picking the themes of these chapters, I knew they were going to be about the 30s. There are originally 7, now there are 4. I just trusted my instincts. I didn't have a big overarching plan. When I had to write the introduction, I'm like, I'm going to die. I have no overarching. my editor kept saying, what's the single argument of the book? And I said, it doesn't have one. I don't write that way. That's not what I wanted to do. I don't think that way. It doesn't add up to a single thing. But when it was all done and I had to write an introduction, I realized all the chapters are about working people and about how they struggled in hard times, but not just how they struggle in hard times, but how they struggle collectively. And, I'll talk a minute about the stereotyped images of the Great Depression, but it's always the individual white man of the breadline or the migrant mother and Dorothea Lange's photograph. Or maybe you get masses of white industrial workers at a General Motors strike, but at most, but you don't get the complex ways in which people organize collectively, not just to make revolutions, but to survive and to oppress people from below. And I realized this is what I've always been about. And I'd be curious to know what my students have to say, because this is a book that's about my teaching self more than anything I ever did. And I wanted to listen to, sorry, my allergies are bad, and channel how working people themselves understood the world using what they said and what they wanted. And I was able to do that because I had amazing oral histories. And when I was in graduate school in the 80s, we kind of thought, and there was a big oral history boom in the late 80s and early 90s. And we thought, I have to say, I was at Yale. We were very elitist about historical practice. We thought, and now I'm like, I worship all the people that did the oral histories in the 70s and 80s, because I have amazing voices of Mexicans who were forced out of the country and came back. I have amazing voices of white farm workers who talk about what they thought of Grapes of Wrath when the answer is they hated it. I have fascists talking about somebody talking about their fascist father. I have all different kinds of voices, and African-American communists. I mean, I have all different kinds of voices, and I don't have to tell this all in my own story. I can say, here's the stories that they told. And also part of the subset of argument of the book is I wanted to help younger people understand the New Deal, because there's a lot of talk about a Green New Deal. And I noticed that a lot of young people don't know about the New Deal. They just know we're for a green one. And so, and there are a lot of debates about the race and gender politics of the New Deal. So each chapter by the end tells you what that group did or didn't get from the New Deal. And some people, like the unemployed movement, produced a piece of it, like unemployment insurance, but not everybody that helped produce it got it, which is women. And so some of it, those tensions that are in there, farm workers, for example, in the fields got mostly nothing. So before I jump in, I'm going to mostly just talk about some specific chapters. Let me just say that, something about studying the 30s. In the 70s, there was a rediscovery of writing about the Great Depression, because it was seen as this moment of all this really cool activism, which it does. And the question is, okay, how do we make a revolution now? That was really cool. They didn't quite do it. Let's go back there and see how they did it and celebrate it. And I'm still there. I still want to do that, but we're in more sobering times. And subconsciously and consciously, when I was I picked these topics like 5 years ago, which is now getting weirder and weirder when you hear about them, because I want topics that would speak to our own time and to political questions that I thought mattered, and you'll hear what they are. But the book is about not just about how to imagine working people's activism in exciting and positive ways, but the hard parts as well, and the sobering parts of the things that happen. And of course, it has turned out that the hard parts just got harder. This is the first time I've talked about the book since the elections. And it's one thing to say the fascists are coming and the deportations are coming in the book. And now I'm like, guess what? It's really a different framework. And in fact, I was on Inside Edition, taped an interview with me this morning, which is like, how do you talk to the masses who might have voted Trump about the fascists in the 30s? And it's obviously a scary time and different questions are popping. But I was talking to Stacy about this. The great gift of being a historian of working people in the struggles and doing it for 45 years is that deep in your bones that people will always rise up and that you don't know what will happen next. And the biggest example I've always taught is the repression of the 1920s, the anti-immigrant politics of the 1920s. And when the labor movement was mostly dead in the water, nobody thought the 30s and the massive uprising of the CIO and the transformation of the state as a result and for other reasons was going to happen next. And in the middle of a huge economic crisis. So you just don't know. In my lifetime, and most of you are not so young, but some are, but I've seen the Seattle WTO protests. I've seen Black Lives Matter, the gay rights movement, which is the most obvious successful social movement you can think of, the solidarity movement with the Palestinian people. And I was at a big conference in Chicago a couple months ago, and Angela Davis is up there, and she's 80, right? And she says, one thing about being old is you actually see things that you didn't see were happening. She said she was always part of the struggle and support of the Palestinian people. But if you had said this movement, global movement, was going to be out there, she would not have, you wouldn't believe it. And so she said the same thing. So now I'm just going to talk about the specific chapters and read 3 passages. And I'm actually going to read different ones than I would have before, because I don't know that we really want to hear about the fascists tonight. So I'll tell you what they're about, and you can go read it. The first chapter is starts with the early 30s, and so it's sort of chronological. And it's about how people tried to meet their needs through grassroots organizing in the years before the New Deal. So the New Deal, Roosevelt's election 32, he comes into office in 33. So the first chapter is, part of it is about mutual aid and the cooperative movement. And in fact, Clark Kerr, you folks know who Clark Kerr was, famous president of the University of California, Chancellor Berkeley, turned the troops on and the war movement, buildings named after him everywhere. Clark Kerr was the ultimate overachiever. He wrote his dissertation on the cooperative movement in California. He interviewed people all over the West. It was a 1,290-page dissertation that I read every page of, and I had to go to the Library of Congress to get a copy of it and take pictures of it and print out from, like, in order to read it. And believe me, and there's a Clark Kerr story in there. He actually was supported the co-op movement in order to undermine the left and the unemployed movement of the Communist Party. So there's a whole politics of who Clark Kerr was in the story. So on the one hand, I'm looking at how people tried to, from below in horizontal networks, take care of themselves. And also, as they would have said, build a new social order. But the other half of that chapter is about how they said, that's not enough. People that said, we have to make demands on the state through, and mostly it's about the Communist Party's activism, but also the Socialist Party, and also demands on landlords. So very successful eviction protest movement and unemployed movement that had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets in March of 1930, 6 months after the stock market crashed. And it was very much a specter that is part of what made the New Deal possible, because they were afraid of the Russian Revolution and they didn't know what was going, which doesn't mean it was a revolutionary moment, but that doesn't mean that elites and liberals didn't know that it wasn't. And that's what brought us unemployment insurance. So it's contrasting that, pivoting to make demands on the state in particular versus how we need to model and organize things from below. And they're not mutually exclusive, but thinking through the strength and also the gender politics of both. It turns out that mutual benefit societies and the co-op movement were extremely patriarchal and exclusionary of women. And, I've been studying women's history and women's labor my whole life. And my editor, who's been around for a long time, she says, why am I surprised by this? But I was still like, whoa. And that sort of models what the New Deal is going to do, because women are going to be cut out of except independent relationships in heterosexual families are going to get cut out most of the New Deal. I'm going to read just the beginning of that chapter, since I'm now going to the more uplifting stories rather than the scary ones. So we're all in a precarious state. This is the beginning of the main part of the book, the first chapter, of the first chapter. And it takes a little while, okay? In the fall of I've never read this part before. In the fall of 1931, as the nationwide tide of unemployment continued to rise inexorably, 50 men started an encampment along the docks near downtown Seattle. They chose a sandy lot owned by the city's port commission, where the waters of Puget Sound lapped on 2 sides. Quote, we immediately set out to construct a relief system of our own, in which the residents could, quote, take care of themselves, recalled a leader. Twice the police burned down all their houses. Twice the men rebuilt. Finally, in June 1932, the city gave them permission to stay. Word got out and the encampment's population swelled. The residents named their community Hooverville, as did similar camps throughout the country in the early 1930s, mocking President Herbert Hoover's ineffectiveness in the face of the Depression. A researcher in 1934 that reported that 455 residents were white, 120 Filipino, 29, quote, Negroes, 25 Mexican, 2 Japanese, 2, quote, Eskimos, 2, quote, American Indian, 2 Costa Rican, and 1 Chilean. 2/3 of those he categorized as white were immigrants, overwhelmingly from Sweden, Norway, and Finland. Using cardboard, canvas, and discarded construction materials, much of it donated by sympathetic local businesses, the residents built little houses for themselves, ranging from tiny leaky shacks that might smell of fish to an elaborate multi-room home with a flower box hanging outside. But we discovered that gas tanks from automobiles made good stoves to cook on when set upon legs, and a pipe was fitted to take care of the smoke, one resident recalled. They covered their interior walls with magazine covers, bits of wallpaper, postcards, and sometimes lingerie ads. During the day, the men fanned out into the city to make a living, finding odd jobs selling newspapers, working on boats, or fixing shoes. A few built or salvaged tiny rowboats and caught salmon and trout to sell. Some made little two-wheel pushcarts to collect and sell paper that had accumulated in downtown alleyways, or to carry home wood and donations from grocers. Otherwise, the men, mostly older, spent their days tinkering on their houses or hanging out and talking while drinking a lot. One observer reported, quote, an almost universal geniality, friendliness, and hopefulness. Former seamen, cannery workers, lumberjacks, domestic servants, day laborers, and miners, quote, all that they have ever known have been camps and jungles, one resident emphasized. The men apparently like to live here. Donald Roy, a young white graduate student who lived in the camp for a month in 1934, described its race relations as he saw them. Quote, a spirit of camaraderie is carried over racial barriers, he said. Mutual adversary has brought animosity to a minimum, and white and colored are tolerant, if not actually friendly. He wrote that, quote, although spatial and social segregation of the Filipinos and Mexicans is a general rule throughout the village, this sorting may be the result of acquaintance ties and preferences and difficulty of expression in English, unquote. In Roy's account, only rarely would a white be heard to express antipathy toward the colored races, although some believe that the depression was due to the influx of Filipino labor to the US, unquote. Roy also reported that sexual relations between men were, quote, rampant in his phrase, including same-sex partnerships in which two men shared a household. Quote, several made no pretense of concealing their, quote, marital status during conversations, Roy said. He himself was regularly, quote, sounded out about his views on sex with other men by those interested in him, and was propositioned 3 times. One man offered, quote, if you live with me, I'll treat you fine and I'll get you a good job later on when I get mine back. Another, whom Roy identified as African-American, proposed, stay with me and I'll hustle you all the food you can eat. I'll bring you chickens, pork chops, oranges, or anything you want, unquote. Roy counted 11 interracial relationships between men living together. 4 of them involved a Mexican man and a white man. 3 were Filipino white, 2 black white, 1 black Filipino, and 1 Filipino Eskimo, unquote. He reported, on many occasions, the writer strolled arm in arm up the camp streets with Negroes and Filipinos. His gestures of friendliness were taken for granted, unquote. But other residents, Roy reported, stigmatized gay sex. One camp leader glared at him, quote, insinuated that the investigator's interest in his fellow Hooverites was sexual and threatened, we're going to run all the punks out of here. Now, it's clear that Donald Roy himself was part of the scene. You can see by he's walking arm in arm with these other men. Overall, Seattle's Hooverville offered its male residents a remarkably independent experiment in collective life. They were clear that their encampment was a vast improvement over what the do-gooders at the Salvation Army or other agencies had to offer. In a 1938 memoir, Jesse Jackson, a white former logger originally from Texas who had helped found the community, denounced the treatment he and others had experienced at a local shelter, where dinner resembled pig swell more than it did human food. 1 week of this kind of abuse was enough. Hooverville, by contrast, offered the space for self-government. The residents chose a 6-person committee to manage themselves, composed of 2 Filipinos, 2 African Americans, and 2 whites. Jackson, one of the 2 white members, was soon identified as the informal mayor of Hooverville and spent his days adjudicating disputes, interfacing with authorities, and bringing in doctors when needed. Hooverville certainly wasn't perfect. The homes could have rats and bugs and were uniformly damp. There was nowhere to bathe. Alcoholism was pervasive. The men shared only 4 outhouses perched over the water on pilots reached by rickety wooden walkways, below which raw sewage plopped directly into the Sound or rotted on the beach intermixed with garbage, dead fish, and kelp. Crime was widespread. The residents had their own way of addressing it internally. In some cases, they asked men to leave and then dismantled their houses entirely. But police, fire, and welfare authorities entered regularly to enforce safety codes and arrest people for thefts, stabbings, and quote, drunken brawls. For all of Hooverville's successful self-government, Jackson underscored, quotes, most laws are not laid down by us, but for us, by city authorities. Seattle's Hooverville offers us a vivid example of the ways in which ordinary people, faced with a non-functioning economy, a federal government that was utterly failing to address the crisis, and few prospects for a viable economic future, chose the path of collectively managing meeting their needs from below. They chose to, quote, take care of themselves, as the men in Hooverville put it, especially during the earlier years of the Depression, before the New Deal stepped in. And, I think this is an amazing story. There's been a lot written about Hooverville, and that master's thesis by Donald Roy has been used a lot, and nobody picked up on the story about the gay marriages. And which also says something to me about straight people being uncomfortable with mainstreaming LGBTQI history. Because how is it that that story was just sitting there all those years? It's amazing. And, when I say to people, oh yeah, my book opens with interracial marriages between men in a homeless encampment in Seattle, it's like a jaw dropper, right? But it wasn't not rocket science to find that story. And so that's the first chapter. And it's really about, goes on to more militant activism, as I said, particularly in the unemployed movement and eviction protests, which is not unique to me to write about them. The other really uplifting story is something that I saw this in a picture in Life magazine from 1937 when I was researching something else 25 years ago. And I saved the clipping and I remembered the story. And I turned to a friend of mine who teaches African-American history about it. And I said, get a grad student to write about this. It's an amazing story. And she forgot all about it. And I kept the clipping. And when I chose to write this book, I went back to it. And I spent a year just researching and writing this story. And the picture is in the book and you can see it. It was excerpted in a new Black Left magazine called Hammer and Hope, which you haven't seen it yet. Google Hammer and Hope magazine. It's free online. The most amazing antidote to what's going on in the world right now. Founded by Kiana Yamada Taylor, if you know who she is, and Jen Parker. And there's amazing stuff in there. It was a big honor that they excerpted this story. But now I'm a motorcycle girl. Okay. And it's a story of, here, I'm going to read excuse me, this is the part I'm reading, the other part I'm reading here. The chapter is called Whose Labor Movement? This is a little shorter. Well, on a usual day, 7 young Black women would show up first thing in the morning at a, quote, milk station on the south side of Chicago to work as wet nurses, selling their breast milk to the city of Chicago. They'd change out of their street clothes into uniforms, seat themselves around a table, and silently express their milk for an hour. But on Monday morning, March 15th, 1937, they instead walked to the City Hall office of Dr. Herman Bundesen, president of the Chicago Board of Health, sat down in 2 rows of straight back white chairs along the sides of his anteroom and announced that they were on strike. They kept on their coats and their dark round hats with small feathers tucked into the brims. They kept on their long scarves with bright stripes or flowers that wound around and down their necks. Their knees almost touching in the tiny space, they took off their gloves and held them tidily on their laps under their hands, folded atop their purses. In a photo captured by Life magazine, the women's faces are turned to each other, laughing, smiling, full of joyous friendship and audacity. One of them in the rear of the room leans forward and to the side a bit to better catch her fellow striker's words. When a reporter asked the women how long they planned to stay, Mary Hart, age 20, declared, quote, we can strike as long as we have to, and we certainly will. We'll be here every day from 8:30 to 4:30. This extraordinary strike by Chicago wet nurses was just one of thousands of sit-down strikes that erupted throughout the United States in 1936 and 37, especially in the upper Midwest. Most famously, workers newly organized in the United Auto Workers staged a sit-down strike at General Motors plants in Flint, Michigan, outside Detroit. On February 11, 1937, General Motors, the biggest corporation in the world, agreed to recognize the union and soon negotiated higher wages and improved working conditions. Over the next few weeks, sit-down strikes, or even the threat of them, produced immense union victories for workers in steel and auto plants nationwide, and for many other workers as well, especially factory workers. All told, in March 1937, a total of 167,210 workers sat down in 170 different strikes. But those 7 women in Chicago weren't factory workers. Their job was selling part of their bodies. Their work represented one of the most highly exploited forms of women's labor imaginable. It falls under the broad category of what feminists understand as reproductive labor, including domestic work performed in the home. What does a heroic labor movement of the 1930s look like if we center our story on Black women's reproductive labor, moving the frame far away from white men working in factories? What can the striking workers tell us about imagining and building a labor movement today that affirms all forms of labor, the labors of all working people? During the 1930s, the New Deal instituted a system of labor rights that is celebrated rightly for its gains for working people. But using the wet nurses as our compass, we can ask whether the New Deal's key labor systems deliver for all workers. To appreciate the wet nurses and their militant determination, we have to go deep into their world and try to understand the labor they performed and gradually pull back to understand their daily lives, their city, its cultural and political offerings, and what the broader labor movement, the federal government didn't ask them. Newspaper reports at the time give us the gift of photographs of the strikers, their names, and miraculously, their voices. As we follow the women's path from oppression to empowerment, we can trace the resources and examples of protests available to them in the Black community of South Chicago at that exact moment of time, especially among African-American women, that made it possible for them to sit down on those white chairs, their hands tightly folded in their laps, with smiles on their faces, gloves off. And it's an amazing story. I mean, just trying to figure out who they were and how they came from. I had their names, I had their addresses. I had 9 quotes that I eked everything I could out of them. There's a great, somebody sent me this 3-line clipping. The strike was actually really famous. It was all over the newspapers, all over the country, sometimes mocked by racists and sometimes in supportive ways. And somebody sent from the Department of Labor Library, sent me a clipping from an Adelaide newspaper in Australia. And the reporter asked them, are you friends with John L. Lewis? And John L. Lewis was a famous Welsh American head of the mine workers and leader of the CIO. And one of them says, "Oh, you must mean Joe Lewis, the boxer." And it's this great quote because the reporters clearly making fun. The reader is presumably white and thinks these women are stupid. It took me 2 months to realize, like, oh, they think the reporter's stupid, right? And the joke was on the reporter. And so I built it like, well, how did they get their power? And Richard Wright wrote his first nonfiction piece for the communist magazine called The New Masses, all about when Joe Lewis beat the white boxer, whose name escapes me, and 25 Black people in south side of Chicago poured into the streets. And he says they got power from Joe Lewis. And I had already said that. And then I find Richard Wright saying that. But of course, and that's sort of like, well, what was going on in South Side Chicago that they got power from that? Not just Joe Lewis, but the whole scene, Chicago Defender, all kinds of things, Communist Party, the YWCA, but also they got power from John L. Lewis too. Even if they didn't know who he was, they're getting power from the CIO. So that's the really uplifting, wonderful story. There's 2 that are more disturbing. And one that is popping now, but and in some ways it came from my work on Honduras and the history of the caravans. It's called The Tale of 2 Caravans. And it's comparing, contrasting 2 caravans or migrations in the 1930s. One of almost 1 million Mexicans and their children who were US citizens who were forced out of the country, not deported. 82,000 were actually deported, but they were basically forcibly expelled or made to not feel welcome in the first few years of the Great Depression by social workers, by police, by local authorities, by employers. And then there's been more attention to what happened in LA, where there were raids and a lot of very scary things that happened. In Texas, there were caravans that moved through Texas from St. Louis, from Chicago, but also through other parts of Texas, caravans of like 1,000, 100 people that would move together collectively and be supported by the local Mexican business community along the way. And really beautiful stories of these caravans and almost parades where people cheered them as they crossed south over the border. And so I wanted to talk about collective action as collective survival. It wasn't not safe. There are little small examples of resistance to repatriation, but I also wanted that story central in our understandings in the 1930s, because how many people here even knew this happened? See, you can see how small it is. I mean, some people know about Operation Wetback in 1954, but this was a big central story in the 30s that has disappeared mostly from our narratives outside of the Mexican American community and Chicano historians, in particular, Chicano generation, that interviewed people and put this back in the, and so that we had books to teach and so we could talk about it. Instead, this story was erased, and my chapter is about how one story is erased, and it goes into these people's stories and what happened in Mexico, and then some of them come back. In the place, we have this enshrinement of the story of the so-called Dust Bowl migrants who, and there were 300,000, about a third as many people who migrated from the Southwest, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Texas, and migrated from there to California in the 1930s. And these are the so-called Dust Bowl migrants, sometimes referred to as the Okies and Arkies, which were very nasty pejorative terms, so I don't use them. And they've been enshrined in the popular imagination as the heroic figures of the 1930s. And, stop and think about your visual imagery of working people in the Great Depression. And when you're not getting the white man in the breadline, you get Dorothea Lange's pictures of suffering, isolated individual white farm workers, most famously the migrant mother. And actually somebody excerpted the epilogue in my book, which says nothing about the migrant mother, and put it as the illustration without asking me, even though I have 10 pages critiquing it. The migrant mother was in fact Cherokee. Her daughter when she found out her picture had been used by Dorothea Lange, she was furious. 20 years later, before she even knew, her daughter has been interviewed. She said it wasn't like that at all. We went to the movies, we had ice cream, my dad was around. I mean, and also that erases. So not only did it enshrine, and the mother was born in the Cherokee Revolution, part Choctaw and part Cherokee. And so that stand-in for the migrant mother, and the migrant mother thing is still out there. You talk about Honduran women at the border, Central American women at the border, they're called migrant mothers. And the other image that you get is of, you either get a passive intellectualized white poor person not doing nothing except not even surviving, or you get militant images of the white men pouring out of the factories, really wonderful, powerful images. But all these people, there are some people in my book kind of just disappear from that story. And so there's this dominant liberal, and you can read it in the book, John Steinbeck had a lot to do with this. And the actual Dust Bowl migrants, only 6% of them actually experienced the Dust Bowl. 50%, this is Jim Gregory's research, 50% of them were urban to urban. They still had white privileges. If you read the oral histories with them and with African-American, part of that migrant that were oral histories that were done at Cal State Bakersfield, they're riveting. All those people hated the Grapes of Wrath. They said it was completely inaccurate, every one of them. And they all said, but also you can see white privileges that the white migrants had that the Black migrants didn't. Their uncle had a store, so they could work in the store. Their uncle ran tractors, so they got a tractor job. They came to some money so they could buy a house, a piece of land and farm. They had an aunt in San Jose they could stay with. I mean, you can see it over and over again, the white privileges in this story. And Steinbeck himself, white, I don't want to focus on Steinbeck too much because he himself had written people of color out of the story. Mexican and Filipino farm workers have been doing extremely successful farm labor organizing in California in the 30s, culminating in a cotton worker strike of like 40,000 people that won hugely in 1933 and was very much repressed by the growers and the state. And he wrote a book called In Dubious Battle, you may have heard of, that was based on that strike and another strike. The workers in those strikes were 75% Mexican and Filipino, and John Steinbeck made them all white. And there's a lot of, and he wrote some nonfiction stuff in which he said, the Anglo-Saxons are ready for democracy and the Mexicans are not, and the Asians live on a bowl of rice. I mean, really nasty white supremacist stuff. And it's documented in the book that I know I'm wrecking Grapes of Wrath for you, but I'm calling it it's like the Gone with the Wind of, and in fact, that camp where they happily dance at the end in the John Ford movie was for whites only, and Africans, Americans, and Mexicans, Filipinos were not allowed by the federal government to stay in those camps. So there's a racial politics and then you contrast that with the erasure of the struggles of the Mexican and Filipinos and Black workers and their history of militants. And the white workers were not interested in organizing. They were much more individualistic because they had not been working as farm laborers. And the Mexicans and the Filipinos had a generation. They had been farmers too in their sending countries, but they had a generation of learning to organize collectively. So the last chapter is the creepy crawly one, the warnings about fascism one, and it's about white supremacist fascist organization in that part of Midwest called the Black Legion. And how many have ever heard of this one? Okay, I think, and did you hear of it because of the Humphrey Bogart movie? Is this how you knew about? Okay, well, there's a terrific Humphrey Bogart movie from 1937. He's very young and very thin. And you may know about, it was a spinoff and inherited the Ku Klux Klan, which had really boomed particularly in the North in the 20s and then collapsed. And the Black Legion was based in Lima, the town of Lima, Ohio. They say Lima. And I went and studied the history. There were really amazing records from the FBI and elsewhere and oral histories. And I went to Lima and I studied how it grew and how it appealed to white working class men in Lima. And it was anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic and anti-Black and fascist and militaristic and brutal. They killed at least 50 people in Black and white in Detroit. Probably Malcolm X's family believed that they killed his father. And it was very secret. And in Lima, the mayor, the chief of detectives, the prosecutor who became a four-term congressman, and the chief of police and the head of the Federal Employment Relief Agency and all the entire staff of the Federal Relief Agency were all members of the Black Legion. And it was only blew up and fell apart when some brave prosecutors in Detroit in 1936 they got somebody to squeal about the killing of a white man in Detroit, and they prosecuted 12 men in a very famous trial that became national news. It was all over the papers about fascism come to the United States in the 1930s. It had about somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 members. Nobody really knows. Nobody's really researched it except a little bit about Detroit. So I was very interested in, I chose to write about this 5 years ago, right? And it was sort of the missing piece in the history of American fascism, because we know about Father Coughlin and Huey Long, the big populist figures. We know about the German-American Bund, which you've probably heard about them recently because they had a big rally of 20,000 people supporting the Nazis in 1939, I think. And it was big, scary national news. And Trump deliberately went to Madison Square Garden to echo that. And also there was something called the Silver Shirts that was in California that was echoing the brown shirts of the Nazis. And the Black Legion, it was sort of, and probably know that Rachel Maddow has done her series about Nazi supporters in the US in the 40s. And she did a wonderful book called Prequel that you can read. They probably have it here. In fact, I got to meet Rachel Maddow a year ago in San Francisco at History Convention. And I went up to her and said, I'm a fan. And I said, I've just written something about the history of the Black Legion in Lima, Ohio. And watching Rachel Maddow's face light up because she knew it was big. And then I said, and it's Jim Jordan's district. And I'm watching her. In fact, there's a whole story in the book that I spun out in something called the History News Network 2 weeks ago about this congressman who was a member of the Black Legion, who there was a big Senate hearing about him having been a member of the Black Legion in 1947. And the story of it, I just wrote that one up. So I did have the great man story after all. So the chapter is partly, it was the hardest one to write for obvious reasons. It was really intense and about what its appeal was and what they did, but also who stopped it and who didn't. And what the answer is, a lot of people whose job it was to stop didn't. Like J. Edgar Hoover knew all about it. And he actually shut down investigation when it hit national news in 1936. But it's like local prosecutors actually in Detroit that broke the story, and a lot of brave local people and media people. And so, you can read in the book. See, now you have to buy the book, but you can read in the library. Don't tell Stacy I said that. Though there's Stacy. So I'm writing a ton here. I just want to so you can see the book is partly stories that I chose because they resonate with contemporary challenges, and partly stories I wrote because I think they're inspiring and give us paths forward. And I'm going to end. So I finished the book. It nearly killed me off. I was really tired when I wrote the first chapter, which I wrote last, because the fascism chapter nearly killed me off. And I had to turn the book in, and I was really tired. And it was like that winter, like 2 years ago when it had rain and rain and rain and rain. Remember that? And it was like April and it was still raining, and the book I had to turn on April 1st, and I nearly killed myself writing an introduction because I didn't know what to say. And then I had to have an epilogue. Okay. And my editor and I agreed I had to have an epilogue. I could not end it with a fascist. And I'm like already sobbing over the introduction. And so I'm like, I don't know what to say. I have 3 paragraphs and I wrote I don't know what to say. And then I took a, Stephen King, he's written stuff about writing that's really good. And somebody says, oh, you're so brilliant. And he said, no, it's 90% hard work and 10% magic. And this is mad. This is a true story. I've been sobbing. I was calling people I know and saying, what do you put in an epilogue? I'm going to sneeze. I'm not crying. I'm going to sneeze. Okay. Although I will cry. And I took this big nap, as I want to do in the afternoon of a day when I'm writing or working. And as I was waking up from nap, the story came to me fully formed, not the beginning, but you'll see where that happened. Okay. And these people at the beginning are all characters in the book at different points. William Smith, the Lima, and this is short, the Lima farmer in his overalls who talked back to Virgil Effinger, the fascist leader, even though he was surrounded by hundreds of armed men with flashlights. Ruby Lucas, who sat on the stoop in her squirrel coat with a cup of coffee and announced, quote, "I'm warring on the millionaire bankers whose greed has turned widows and orphans and destitute into slaves," unquote. Mary Hart camped out in a white chair at City Hall in Chicago, who told reporters, quote, "What they've been paying ain't enough for car fare," unquote. The unnamed elderly man on horseback who, as he crossed the border, threw his hat up in the air and shouted, "Viva Mexico." All of them, along with the inspiring collective actions of which they were part, have seemingly disappeared from history. So too the more chilling figures here, the men who held the flashlights, the policemen who threw down their badges and guns when told they could only use sticks, not bullets, against African-American relief protesters. Indeed, a common theme emerges in these chapters: invisibility. Women's domestic labor was invisible to both their menfolk and to the state. The expulsion of 1 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans was invisible to most Mexicans and remains so. And then there was the Black Legion trying to hide its clandestine work of hate. The Ku Klux Klan, after all, was known as the, quote, "invisible empire." Today, in most mainstream renditions of the Great Depression in the United States, these stories from the grassroots remain largely invisible, largely, quote, "forgotten." We need their stories, though, for our own time, full of its own terrors: resurgent fascism, steel borders, climate change. Neither capitalism nor racism has collapsed. Patriarchy hums along. Today, we need our own New Deal, too, an activist state that curbs the rich, defends labor rights, redistributes wealth, and provides a safety net and free healthcare for everyone. We can join those who advocate for a Green New Deal to help stave off climate disaster. Trying to use the state to contain capitalism won't ever be enough, though, because in its very nature, the system dedicates itself to slipping out of and tearing apart any fetters. We need, like those seeking social justice in the 30s, to dream of our own new social order, to build social movements that demand it, and to model it in our own collective lives. During the time I wrote this book, 3 scary plagues visited my community. The first, of course, was the COVID pandemic. The second was a set of fires in August 2020 that destroyed over 700 homes in the Santa Cruz area, including those of people I knew, burned down acres and acres of beloved forests, and crept close enough to my house that the evacuation line was 8 blocks away. For another year, we prayed for rain, but instead got more drought. In the last months before I finished this book, drenching rain was finally predicted for the day after Christmas. So I hurriedly planted grass where gophers had torn up the more or less lawn covering my backyard and had left bare dirt that turned into gunk that I tracked constantly into the house. I raked the soil, sowed grass seeds, covered them with mulch, then over it all spread burlap coffee sacks to protect the seeds from the birds, anchoring down the corners with bricks. Then it rained in biblical proportions for days and days. Plague number 3. Sinkholes 4 blocks from my house appeared on the national news, as did a levee breach in a nearby town that destroyed the homes and livelihoods of hundreds of already impoverished people. Less disastrously, my own backyard turned into a lake, which inched into my study and garage. It was only 1 inch deep. No historical research was hurt, but the seeds were underwater. For 3 weeks, I watched the lake drown them. When the lake finally receded, I lifted off the bird lap, sadly. The seeds were still there. Sparrows, juncos, and towhees arrived every morning to peck away at them, but no grass. One morning, though, I detected individual thin, dark blades miraculously scattered across the X-Lake. Then it flooded again for another entire week. Now I mourned my drowned grasslings, which I imagined waiting for help underwater, kelp-like in the murky swamp. Finally, the water sank for good. With a bit of sun, the grass babies flourish, their roots happy in the rich muck, locking in each other in spreading horizontal networks that joined other thicker patches on nearby higher ground. I looked out the window and saw a beautiful sea of green fur. We are not grass, but we know how to survive fire and flood and beasts that tear up our landscapes. We know how to lay low, then rise up. We know how to survive when we are underwater. We know how to link our roots with others. We know our roots can flourish in deep muck. We know how to thrive. And we know how to learn from history. William Smith, Ruby Lucas, Mary Hart, and the man on horseback didn't in fact disappear. They all appeared in newspapers at the time, which is where I found them, and they are now in this book almost 100 years later, speaking to us they aren't invisible. In taking on the terrors of our own time, we can learn from the grassroots activists of the 1930s who sought justice and equality and carry them in our hearts as we step off our stoops, step over borders, and march into the streets, sinking our toes deep into the rich, messy muck of history. Magic. Magic. It's magic. This is why I'm pro nap, okay? You know.
So while we're waiting for questions from the room, I actually have some questions from online already.
Oh my God, this is like, or like, what is this reminding me of? Something on television.
Chanel says, longtime Dana Frank fan, love how you're diving into the white privilege, racial politics, plus the erasure of race within the Great Depression. I also love the example of Hooverville since a slice of hope, as a slice of hope. Don't know how, let's see, hold on a second. Don't know how to find this is a question, so I will fumble through it here. How do we build together when it often feels as if we are repeating ourselves in history? What path do you think is taking that leads us forward and not backwards?
Okay. Well, there's a $64,000 question. I mean, you know, I actually went to this big conference called Through the Portal that was organized by Barbara Ransby at University of Illinois, Chicago, like about a month before the election. Then, you know, people had really, you know, like coalition, but I mean, all the things you can think of. I mean, but there was this, and this is before the elections, there was a lot of despair. But I mean, the main thing is like, you know, people always hang up to that. I mean, the person that I'm most listening to right now is Robin D.G. Kelly, and watch him on Democracy Now! Like a few nights ago. And he has a piece as of today or yesterday in the Boston Review, where I think he gives us the path forward about coalitional anti-racist working class politics that are internationalist. And, you know, I think, you know, I did an interview this morning with Inside Edition, which is the most mainstream I've ever gotten in my life. And it was very interesting to talk about the Black Legion in a way that is different. And knowing that a lot of listeners or viewers, it turned out to be, I was on television. I didn't realize that it's actually on video, but not television. But they were looking at me, they were filming me. And to say that, you know, white working class people, especially white working class men, have long had a choice. And my students know this since the late 19th century. They could choose hate and choose to bash immigrants and choose racism, or they can choose coalitions and they can look up and challenge the rich. And I think we have to have anti-racist class politics that take on the billionaires. It's pretty obvious. I don't, you know, and you know, we've got folks here that work with the labor movement, you know, John Logan, John Marshall, other folks here. And, you know, we have to build that anti-racist working class movement broadly defined that talks about all workers and their work and is creative and anti-imperialist. I mean, and, you know, in another life, I'm work on, you know, U.S. policy in Central America. And I don't think I mean, that it's very obvious that the Democratic Party doesn't know how to do this, you know, and we have to like make these demands from below, but we also have, white people have to be willing to be in, you know, listen, to be in second place, you know, and not be taking over leadership, and to be willing to listen. And yeah, I can tell you, when I wrote the chapter about the wet nurse, it's like, please God, let me get this right as a white person. Like, what am I missing here? What am I not seeing because I'm white? And how do I defer to historians who are African American or people who have worked on these issues longer? And, you know, and the scholarship that other people have done. And I think it's also about how white people position. I'm just speaking as a white person here. I could tell people of color what to do, you know, but I also think we have to build a movement that talks about how people are hurting, you know, and starts from there, and that people are hurting across racial lines, and they're hurting because of racism. And we have to take on both. And how we do that, the grassroots, man, I admire other people that are doing that. This morning, it was really great to say some of that on the television, you know, because I thought, it wasn't live, but I was like, oh, I could be useful. Something to do, you know, on the Honduras politics, I knew what I was doing. I mean, I was out there in Congress and I was pushing the needle on U.S. policy. And I guess going to Congress is not going to be the top of our list right now. Thank you, Chanel.
Anyone in the room?
No.
Hi, thank you for the great reading, Dana. And the book, the chapters obviously on mass deportations, on American fascism, couldn't be more relevant. A lot of people know you primarily as a labor historian, and the book of yours I sort of thinking about most recently is the untold by American, the untold story of economic nationalism. And just sort of I mean, I thought this election was going to be a disaster, but that's just a reflection of my personality more than my ability to predict elections. But I just couldn't see any way that Kamala Harris was going to win in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And you know this better than me, but the economy in those places has, with free trade, deindustrialization, the economy that sustained sort of middle class lifestyle for blue collar workers has fallen apart more quickly than anyone expected. Neither Republicans nor Democrats have an answer. And so that makes people vulnerable to someone like Trump riding in this white horse and saying, I have the answers, tariffs, anti-immigrant, etc. And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I mean, what I say is, well, we don't have the answers, but at least the Democrats can have candidates that, at a minimum, speak the language of people in these places. But anyway, you've written about these things, you've thought about them. I don't mean.
No, what's the answers? Well, it's interesting about the Buy American campaign. It's actually somebody's I mean, I wrote this book 25 years ago about Buy American campaigns and anti-Asian racism, and how nationalism as an answer, as opposed to internationalist class solidarity, class racial lines. When Trump in his first inaugural, I kept calling it first inaugural, and I thought, Dana, don't say that. It was just his inaugural. They have to call it that now. It said, Buy American, be American, hire American. He got that straight from when William Randolph Hearst wrote that phrase. I'm sure Stephen Miller, now Deputy Chief of Staff, found that in the Hearst Press, or maybe even got it out of my book. And that it's this nationalist approach, and but you can get it from liberal Democrats. I mean, Sherrod Brown, for example. And I think that, well, first of all, I'll come back to that. But I mean, if you look at the history of the Black Legion, it boomed when the industrial economy fell apart. Now, there was a history of these people had all been in the Klan. Okay, there's a bedrock there. But when the industrial economy fell apart in the 1930s, that's when the Black Legion boomed. When the New Deal comes along and offers them something else, and then the economy booms, the industrial economy booms in World War II, it subsides, right? And then when you get to deindustrialization, this stuff comes back. And, you can follow it like this. The racial hate is correlated with, and then you blame people of color and immigrants and Jews and Catholics, depending on your decade, your combination. And you can see it just like that. But that doesn't mean all our politics should be driven around by how do you keep white working class men happy? But, there's also the Buy American thing. Somebody's actually going to interview me for about a young person about a documentary in next week. And the Buy American question is going to come up all over again, because we're going to get China bashing like you wouldn't believe. I mean, Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, is insane. And he's not as insane as some of them. He won't wipe out the State Department, which, for better or worse, I think we might want to wipe out the State Department. He knows what he's doing. I've heard him rant at Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings for years, and all he cares about is China. And the same is true of the National Security Advisor guys. So we're gonna have a trade war with China, and the price of everything is go up, and anti-Asian racism is going to go out the ceiling. And, that we have to talk about that and how to cut that off at the pass and say no to this kind of nationalism, because that's what Trump is going to play that card. And these guys know what they're doing. And the immigrant bashing is the other side of that coin, and in this case, it will be against Asian immigrants, but not just the Latin American and Haitian immigrants, and Puerto Ricans, for that matter, who are not immigrants, and so, I mean, look, it's intense. I wrote this book 3 years ago, and I didn't think I was going to have to be the one with the answers, and this whole question of what do you learn from history? I mean, I'm glad I wrote it the way I did. I did not write it like, my editor wanted the single argument. I said, I don't have one. It's written in a very more reflective way. I mean, I have some things I clearly want to say at various points, but it's also, this particular Black Legion chapter is the most I don't know, I have who stopped it and who didn't. gave a talk at Georgetown University. This book just came out like a month ago. So 2 weeks before the election, I gave a talk at Georgetown University in the history department. His friend had invited, and I read a blurb like, well, how did fashionism appeal to white working class men in Ohio, right? What was it appeal? Because it was like the first half of the chapter. And then he says meekly, well, you're going to talk about resistance, which of course becomes the question now, right? But it's the resistance it happens on other fronts. It happens like, well, what about those wet nurses? And where did they get the power to do what they do? I mean, it's an amazing story. You wouldn't believe how many women and men, including women of color and Jewish women, are like beating up on cops. I mean, the story of this, there's a picture in here of this rent strike of these Jewish women middle-aged Jewish women in a rent strike in the front of the book. And even if you can't have the money to buy the book, you can get in the library, but there's photographs are amazing and they say to the cops, do you want to come in? Our teapots are hissing because they're going to throw water on the cops. I mean, there's a lot of amazing stories of how people, and also it's I think it's like, how do you not have a white-centered narrative? Because there are I have 3 completely different sources. One is Maya Angelou. One is somebody interviewed in Stud Circle's Hard Times, which is the best book about the 30s ever. And one was somewhere else. And they say, and I got one of them in the book. I thought there were all 3 in there, but there's only one. And they say, oh, the Great Depression, that was a white people thing. Because, it was already terrible. Like we didn't know about it until it got to white people, or like we didn't even know what happened to our town because things were terrible and they always were. And so you have to have like, well, wait a minute, what are our chronologies and paradigms for how do we even understand what happened?
Could you speak, please, to the moods of Americans during the Depression? My sense of it is that people on the whole were not depressed during the crisis of the 1930s. A lot of what I see nowadays, people write a whole lot about hope and optimism, and we have to be optimistic and we have to be hopeful, and it's coming out of my ears.
Well, I think it's kind of like, I don't know, I heard a lot of despair at that Chicago conference. I mean, I think in the 30s, people really were flipped out. There were a lot of male head of households, certainly evidence of Mexican descent, and white men dumping their families because they had shame about not being able to support their families. A lot of those hobos, and there's a shame about not fulfilling their role, and a lot of depression. And people were also, there's a lot about this, that there was a lot of self-blame, not particularly among African-American men, Mexican men, but among white men. A lot of self-blame in the early years. And one of the things huge things that the unemployed movement did, and there's been stuff, I think that's not original to me, is they changed people's sense of shame. And they made it so that they blamed the government, not themselves. And that it was not their failure, that it was a failure the government applied, and they had a sense of entitlement that the government should take care of them, that it was not their own fault. Because what happened was, you can have a national headline that says a third of the country is unemployed and another is unemployed, and people think it was still, you wouldn't believe how many people still thought it was their personal failure. And people stopped thinking that stigma of being unemployed and the stigma of getting government help was thrown out the window by about 1934 by the unemployed movement, and then the response by the liberal state.
Yeah.
Did you have one at the beginning over here, this woman over here? We want to hear from the women folk. You've been in my classroom. I'm like, okay, let's hear from some women.
My question's much simpler. I wanted to hear the end of the story of the wet nurses. What was the
happened?
resolution?
I don't know. Well, you have to read the book. I don't know. They evidently, it's one thing said they settled for 5 cents. They wanted 8 cents or something. It's really unclear. I don't know. I don't know what kind of retaliation. If they got anything, I don't know if they even went back to work. I know that the milk stations evidently shut down in the 50s. They were only there from like the 20s to the 50s. I don't know. Of course, I wish I know. I know what happened the second day. They came back the second day. There's a photograph of them that's really different, where they're looking like, you can tell they're tired and they're like, who's going to mess with me now? And I can reflect, but I don't know. And of course, if I lived in Chicago and I had a year, you could maybe find their grandkids. But, they were famous. You can say all that. Who knows what they want? Anybody that's been around the labor movement, including John, who asked that question, by the way, who's head of labor studies in San Francisco State, and Jim Tracy from Seed College, right? with labor studies and other people here too, you know, we know that labor movement doesn't work that way. You don't like, you win and then they give you, it's in the paper the next day, wet nurses did this and everybody else got that and they won here. Somebody else is afraid, somebody else concedes on something else happens, but not in ways you can track. It's like this and backwards and forwards. And you know, what I want to know, what did they tell their children? What did they tell their grandchildren? What stories are there? Because they were in Life magazine. They were in there was a big photo of them in Life magazine. They were in newspapers all over the country. So do they keep a clipping with that? You know, what's their story? I don't know. But as I say, but we can take that story and I say at the very end of that chapter, and it's at the end of the Hammer and Hope version, which is we can find our own 6 white chairs and 7 white chairs and 6 friends to sit down and do something audacious together and learn that from them. So I'll just end there. Thank you.